Our role as teachers, as mentors, as coaches, as advisors, our role is to bring out unique voices.
An institution like Tel Aviv University is probably the best place to identify and foster such talents, which are, of course, our future.
We're building a future at Tel Aviv. We are working on the most important problems that affect mankind.
When I go to the campus, I can see 30,000 reasons why I am happily involved at Tel Aviv University, and they are the students.
They are at the forefront of computer science, of nanotechnology, of law, of dealing with diversity.
I have had my mind open in a way that's what's surprising to me.
It's just sort of a buzz with activity in a way that American campuses aren't. It's very outwardly focused.
And that energy is very palpable here. I mean, you feel it among the students, you feel it among the faculty.
I think it's on the front line, the frontier of everything, from the humanities to science.
The brain power at Tel Aviv University is such where if you give money to the university and research, you're going to make a change in the world.
It's supporting future leaders and future thoughts, and whether leaders in politics, business, the arts.
They're going into the future. They're expanding their lives. So they're expanding the future of themselves, their families, their close ones, but by and large, society.
The potential is huge, the difference that we can make.
The best way to impact the future is to give the people who are teaching the tools that they need in order to succeed.
It's really great to be able to put our mark on Tel Aviv University and hopefully on Israel and the rest of the world.
I'm really proud of the great work that's being done in the world and that we're able to add our small little part to it.
Changing lives to change the world.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the National Chairman of American Friends of Tel Aviv University, John Gurkoff.
Thank you, thank you. Good evening, everyone, and welcome. On behalf of American Friends of Tel Aviv University, I welcome you to tonight's celebration of Bernard Lewis. Please join me in thanking the ensemble Elad Kabilio, Emily Salmon, and Philip Cramp. They played for us as we were coming in. Elad is a recent graduate of Tel Aviv University's Bookman Mehta School of Music. He's new to New York, but with the preparation he received at Tel Aviv University, he already has played at Carnegie Hall. And that's the level of educational excellence we're so proud to support. We, American Friends of Tel Aviv University, come from many backgrounds, but we have two things in common. We share a love for Israel and a desire to expand the future through educational excellence. Tonight, we bring these two passions together as we showcase TAU's renowned Moshe Dayan Center. And as if to underscore the importance of the Middle East and the work the Dayan Center does, after yesterday's assault on the American Embassy in Cairo, we woke this morning to horrible news, the despicable attack on the American consulate in Benghazi. We mourn the tragic loss of Ambassador Chris Stevens and 3 other diplomats in this reprehensible attack. Even so, we continue to stand with Israel and for peace in this fragile and dangerous part of the world. And now, I'm going to say a motzi for a meal. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam hamotzi lechem min haaretz. Blessed art thou, Lord our God, who brings forth bread from the earth. I now have the pleasure of making a few introductions. First, the man of the hour, the incomparable Bernard Lewis. Our congratulations on your memoir, Notes on the Century. All of us are here to honor your life and your career. Bernard Lewis. Next, our distinguished dinner chairs who made tonight's event possible. The chairman of Tel Aviv University's International Board of Governors, Harvey Krueger. Our former Secretary of State, the Honorable Henry Kissinger. The former president of Tel Aviv University, Ambassador Itamar Rabinovich. And the editor-in-chief of U.S. News and World Report, Mort Zuckerman. Our deep thanks, too, to our featured speaker tonight, Professor Fouad Ajami. Fouad Ajami. We're also privileged to have with us tonight the president of Tel Aviv University, Professor Yossi Klafter, and the head of TAU's Moshe Dayan Center for Middle Eastern and African Studies, Professor Uzi Rabi. I also want to recognize Israel's ambassador to the United Nations, the Honorable Ron Proser. And after introducing all these distinguished gentlemen, it's my pleasure to recognize the remarkable woman in Bernard Lewis's life, with whom he wrote Notes on a Century, Bunsey Ellis Churchill. I'll just quote from the book's dedication. Professor Lewis writes, "For Bunsey, without whose inspiration and guidance this book would not have been written or even started, and without whose presence and participation in this last and best part of my life could not have been lived, Bunsey Ellis Churchill." Now I'm going to stray from my prepared remarks for just one moment, because I want to recognize one other person, and that is Connie Krueger. Connie, thank you so much for your lifetime support of the Jewish community, and it's so nice to see you looking so well, and thank you very much for being here tonight. And last, my thanks to another special woman, the president and CEO of American Friends of Tel Aviv University, Gail Reese. Gail's boundless energy and her team of dedicated professionals have taken this organization to new heights, and we have a very bright future ahead of us. Thank you very much. For those of you who like to know what's coming, you'll find the program on the table, and the program is at the beginning of your journal. I want to thank you all for being here. I know we're all looking forward to hearing from our speakers tonight, so let's begin our program. Thank you.
Now, for our first toast of the evening, from the man who is credited with almost single-handedly opening the international capital markets to Israeli governmental and corporate securities. Please welcome the chairman of the International Board of Governors of Tel Aviv University, Harvey Krueger.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. We're on a tight schedule, which is why I took my time coming up to the dais. But I would like to, for the first time in many, many years, read my notes, because I think what I have to say about our guest of honor is important. In any event, while I'm not given to hyperbole, I do want to tell you about one of the smartest people I have ever met. His name was Baruch Yekutieli, and in 1975 he gave me a gift. The gift was a book, and Baruch said that it was one of the most important books I would ever read. And I read it, and he was right. And the author of the book, of course, was Bernard Lewis. And the book is a small volume of lectures called History Remembered, Recovered, and Invented. Remember, this was written in 1975, or at least it was copywritten in 1975. In any event, I lost my copy many years ago, and when I tried to buy another, it was out of print. But recently, after 2 years of searching, I came into possession of 2 copies. None of you may borrow either of those copies. What made the book so important to me, it gave me a new prism through which to review, critically, all the things I had read and thought were historical fact. The prism is captured in these lines written by Bernard from the book, and I'm going to quote them. In fact, you may see them on a screen somewhere, I'm not sure. Tell it like it was, runs a common American phrase. But this is neither as simple nor as easy as it sounds. The temptation is often overwhelmingly strong to tell it not as it really was, but as we wish it to have been. Of course, it was Bernard's historiography, I have trouble with that word, that resonated for me. Simply and surgically, he identified the wish behind the so-called histories that he wrote about. Look at the political purposes of this invention, he said. Observe the psychological value of that invention. Appreciate the influence another tries to achieve. Even Jewish scholars invented history. In the early 19th century, they fostered the myth that during the 800 years when Spain was under Muslim rule, that there was tolerance for Jews. And I said, yes, tolerance. Even though, as Bernard makes clear, Muslims would have seen such tolerance as being a sin against the holy law of Islam. And why manufacture such a history? Because the invention, as I said, by Jewish scholars, of Islamic tolerance gave the Jews a weapon to use against their Christian neighbors. It is a patently false myth to serve useful political purpose. History as we wish it to be. Muslim historians themselves are inventors. Bernard advises that the word crusades was never mentioned in the accounts of the time. Only much later did the Crusades emerge as a heroic Muslim victory, a jewel in the crown of what became their official history as opposed to their real history. And why? Because in the course of time, the Muslims triumphed and finally drove the Crusaders into the sea. And in another part of this book, Bernard warns, the moral is obvious, that it may take a century, or it may take 2, but sooner or later, Israel might go the same way. And we have to be sure that that doesn't happen. And one last example by Bernard of wished history. It's from a preface by a man named Sir Henry Eliot to his book, The History of India, as told by its own historians. He wrote in 1849, during the colonial period, employing the writings of earlier Indian historians purely to counter current negative public opinion. Though the intrinsic value, he said, of these works may be small, they will have their uses. They will make our native subjects more sensible to the immense advantages accruing to them under the mildness and equity of our rule. Eliot went on to say, we should no longer hear bombastic baboos, not baboons, but baboos, the wealthy people of the time, enjoying under the British government our highest degree of personal liberty, and many more political privileges than we ever conceded to a conquered nation. Employing these old suspect Indian histories will show, he said, that the British have already done 10 times more to benefit the people than the baboos ever did, and I quote, "We shall fulfill our high destiny as the rulers of India." Imagine how useful it has been to remember that phrase, telling it as one wishes it to have been. And now let's apply that to today's history in the making. An American, and this is not from Bernard, this is mine, so if you disagree, don't disagree with him. Now let's apply it to today's history in the making. An American president will be elected in 2 months. Historians will write about the process and the outcome, and many versions will emerge. In some of those histories, the victor will be brilliant and stalwart, exemplifying the nobility of the American people. In other histories, the victor will be corrupt and malevolent, a manipulator of the poor sheep in the voting booth. Each of the many versions will further a political interest of our time, as we wish it to have been. When we hear these, it will be useful to remember Bernard's invaluable caution, his flashing red light to remind us of the dangers of accepting any history without examining the intent of the historian. It is perfectly natural and normal, he wrote, that questions which an historian puts to the past are those suggested to him by the events of his own time, and much can be learned from the pursuit of such inquiry. What is improper is when the concerns of his own time suggest not only the questions, but also the answers. As Bernard knew, the idea of probing invented history was not just intriguing, it was liberating. It made sense of nonsense. It was a foundation for analysis in so many arenas, professional, personal, philosophical. What a gift that he has given us. I've been fortunate to meet Bernard a few times, but I've never told him how much his clarity and insight meant to me, and this is my opportunity. Bernard, here's to you, with my friendship and admiration entirely uninvented. And one more thank you for so generously donating your complete library to Tel Aviv University. Since I couldn't find copies, since it took me such a long time to find a copy, and now I have 2, it's possible that since you are giving your library to Tel Aviv, that you have none. Accordingly, I am happy to lend you a copy of this magnificent book. Thank you very much.
For our next toast, we're pleased to introduce a man for whom the phrase needs no introduction was invented. Please welcome our former Secretary of State, the Honorable Henry Kissinger.
Bernard and friends, it's a great privilege for me to be here tonight to speak about a man who reminded me that I said to him once that when I have lunch with him, he is somebody to whom I listen. And over the decades, reading his books, meeting him, I have learned an enormous amount. The Middle East is a region of overlapping histories, different cultures, building or attempting to build a new world in the present period. And we are meeting today on an occasion when we have seen demonstrations of fanaticism and ideology whose distinguishing feature is that there were attacks on the sovereignty of the United States caused by actions with which the United States government or people did not have the slightest connection. It's the result of the individual act of an unknown person expressing contemptible views about the Islamic religion. But it had no significance. And if progress is to be made in the Middle East, there has to be a limit put to this kind of ideology and this kind of fanaticism. And such actions cannot remain without consequence. Now, in order to reflect about where we are, there are so many aspects of the contemporary situation. There is the fact that we are living through what has been called the Arab Spring. There are nations trying to redefine themselves. There are nations that are disintegrating. And there is the problem of how do you define peace and how do you maintain it. Bernard has written and spoken on all of these topics. He wrote about Egypt, about its tension between two Egyptian personalities. The one Islamic, its language and culture Arabic, its history that of Islam. The other Egyptian, and so to speak, Pharaonic, defining itself not in religious, but in national and patriotic terms. That was a new and different type of loyalty. That is the Egypt that is now in the process of redefining itself, but it does so amidst countries that were created in the aftermath of World War I on the basis of the preferences of the victors of that long ago war. And events in Syria and Libya deal with the very existence of those states, but also with the very definition of peace. And again, we hear a great deal about that this is a battle for democracy. It is on some levels. But there are also other levels, and again, let me quote Bernard. The Arab masses certainly won't change, and they want improvement. But what does democracy mean in the Middle Eastern context? It is a word that is used with very different meanings, even in different parts of the Western world. And it is a political concept that has no history, no record whatever in the Arab Islamic world. I'm mistrustful, I'm continuing to quote Bernard, and view with apprehension a genuinely free election, assuming that such a thing could happen because the religious parties have an overwhelming advantage. A dash towards Western-style elections, far from representing a solution of the region's difficulties, constitutes a dangerous aggravation of the problem. Now, when Bernard writes about this, it is not an attack on democracy. It is a call for the creation of institutions and procedures by which democracy can be brought into a region which has practiced different forms of expression. So in Notes of a Century, Bernard writes about the pre-modern Middle East. There was a traditional system of concentration with groups which were not democratic as we use that word in the Western world, but which had a source of authority other than the state. Authority which derived from within the group, whether it be the landed gentry, the civil service, the scribes, or whatever. That could be a better basis for the development of a free and civilized government. And I mention these quotes because the fundamental challenge of our period is not to define our purpose by the mood of a moment, but rather by the direction in which we seek to go. And it's, of course, in the middle of this turmoil that Israel wants to find its peace and its future. Very often that issue is presented as if it were a simple negotiating problem of where to draw what lines and how to draft what paragraphs. But the issue is deeper. And again, Bernard has written in the Wall Street Journal, PLO and other Palestinian spokesmen have given the formal indication of recognition of Israel. But that is not the message delivered at home in Arabic. In everything from primary school textbooks to political speeches and religious sermons. Here, the term used in Arabic denotes not the end of hostilities, but an armistice or truce until such time that the war against Israel can be resumed with better progress for success. So the fundamental issue is not the terms of the agreement. The fundamental issue is whether there is reciprocity in the attitude towards the existence of all of the states involved, including especially Israel. That is the challenge. And there the question that is being raised is whether in the midst of the emergence of the Muslim Brotherhood as the dominant groups, it is possible to define not so much terms of an agreement, but realities of coexistence. This is the challenge we all face. We face it, and in a deep sense, the Arab societies face it too, even more so. But we should not pretend that it is just a technical issue. So I want to thank Bernard for recalling us always to our intellectual duties. He tells us the truth as it is. He points out to us that we must, that there are no shortcuts, and that we must not be lazy in analyzing our obligations. I have shared at least one experience with him when he writes that he is always attacked from both sides. And as long as he feels that he's being attacked from both sides, he's confident of his scholarly objectivity. On that basis, I am a great scholar. So let me thank you all for honoring a profound man who has taught me and everybody whose life he has touched a great deal. And let me propose a toast to our honoree, Bernard.
What we are doing right now is just to deal with this ever-changing region called the Middle East. What we are offering our students while coming to schooling to Israel and have their schooling in Middle Eastern studies is a plethora of experiences.
When the program at Tel Aviv came to my attention, I thought that it just made so much sense to study Middle Eastern issues in the Middle East.
I look at a map and I can point to Tel Aviv and I see where I am, and I see where I am in relation to all of the other countries in the Middle East.
I definitely see it with a broadened lens and looking at it from different perspectives and tackling ideas that I hadn't even thought of.
To be there in real time, to know people who are at that moment while you're discussing this in class, that you have a friend or somebody who's right now at some border, defending the country. This is a very different endeavor.
Our program is very, very diverse. We have about 40 people from upwards of 20 different countries. Everybody brings an entirely different perspective.
The big thing that is stressed at the program is that you cannot say anything about a culture until you know their language.
It's conflict resolution, and a lot of it is how you interact with other people. But it really allows you to step back, and the program helps us do that, to step back and sort of evaluate a situation without jumping in and making an observation too quick.
I do think that many of our students are acquiring an understanding of what Middle Eastern diplomacy is.
We have a lot of actual professionals who've been involved in negotiations at the highest levels.
I kept seeing professors from my program getting quoted in the paper.
They're helping to create a generation of people that are aware and that have the outlet to explore potential solutions to the conflicts of our age.
To me, as a kid from the Midwest, from Indiana, who came to LA and suddenly found himself driving a tank in the IDF and then landing in Tel Aviv and at the university, not knowing a lot of people, it was a great place for me, great experience. I made wonderful friends, and it really provided me a sense of place and belonging that I really needed and appreciated, and that's why I'm still involved.
Ladies and gentlemen, we welcome a former president of Tel Aviv University and former ambassador of Israel to the United Nations. It's said that we have Princeton University to thank for bringing Bernard Lewis to America, and our next speaker to thank for bringing Bernard Lewis to Israel. Here is Ambassador Itamar Rabinovich.
Thank you. By the way, it was the United States, not the United Nations, and there is a slight difference. Bernard and Bansi, Michael and Jessica. Michael and Jessica, by the way, are Bernard's son and daughter-in-law. Much has been said about and will be said about Bernard tonight, but we have to remember that above and beyond, he is a father, a grandfather, a great-grandfather, and a son, a great member of his family, part of the personality. How do you compress everything that I know and feel about Bernard Lewis into a few minutes? I'll do it under three headings, and I'll call them scholarship, friendship, wit and humor. So, the scholarship. Harvey Krueger spoke about one of Bernard's great books. Henry Kissinger explained how many insights he and others obtained from Bernard about the Middle East. But to put it in perspective, how many people you know who are in command of 4 civilizations? And Bernard is a classical civilization, European civilization, Jewish civilization, and Islamic civilization with all 3 components, the Arabic, the Persian, and the Turkish. So just think about the scope of the scholarship. How do you define Bernard? He's an Orientalist, a Middle East expert? No. He's a historian. Bernard sees himself as a historian, and he is a historian, and he is a great historian. Bernard's first book, published in 1939, just before World War II, is about an Islamic sect, the Ismailis. But his second book, published after World War II, is called The Arabs in History. There was a book known in those days by the Princeton professor Philip Hitti called A History of the Arabs. But Bernard chose to call his book The Arabs in History. And that's a book or an essay about the relationship of the history of the Arabs to the history of the world. It was a book that was written after World War II and is still irreplaceable today. Now, what does a historian do? A historian looks across the centuries, he puts things in perspective, and he makes us see that. One of Bernard's books is called Semites and Anti-Semites. It's about anti-Semitism in various parts of the world, mostly Islamic part of the world. And Bernard then has a short comment about China. He said that in the Middle Ages there was a Jewish community in China that vanished. And he then says, in a sort of offhand manner, Jews can survive persecution, they cannot survive being ignored. So this is what a historian does. So Bernard the historian. Friendship. Three levels of friendship. Allow me to begin with myself. I laid eyes on Bernard Lewis first time in the mid-60s when I was an undergraduate at the Hebrew University, and we were all shepherded to a lecture by the great Bernard Lewis. I really met him in 1971 when he came to a conference in Tel Aviv University, the young university then. And since 1972, for 40 years, and continuing next year, he's been coming for at least a month and sometimes 3 months to Tel Aviv and Tel Aviv University. So we became very close friends, and this friendship I really cherish. He's been a great friend of the university, and giving the library to the university is just one manifestation of that friendship. And he's been a friend to the State of Israel. Just one fact, on the eve of the 1973 war, he was one of those who brought messages from Egypt to Israel that Sadat really meant peace when he talked about peace. Yet there were many other manifestations of the profound feeling that Bernard has for the State of Israel and the friendship that he has harbored for the State of Israel. He's a great friend to have. And then the humor and the wit. You know, humor is one thing, and in order to have a sense of humor, the first condition is you need to be able to apply it also to yourself. You have to be able to look at yourself from the outside and take a humorous look, not just at the world and at others, but also at yourself. And Bernard has that. And then he has this devastating wit. And I'll share with you one of the anecdotes. Bernard gave a lecture many years ago at the University of Michigan. He spoke about Islam. And then came the Q&A part, and one of the students got up, a student from a Middle Eastern country, and said, "Professor Lewis, you spoke about Islam, you wrote about Islam. How can you do that? You're not a Muslim, and you have not lived the Islamic experience from within." And Bernard looked at him and with a straight face said, "By extension of your logic, sir, only fish could teach marine biology in this university." So those who have known Bernard and have enjoyed his friendship and company have also enjoyed both the humor and the wit. So I want to salute Bernard. I hope we made him happy by this evening of recognition. I want to thank all of you for coming and being part of this wonderful evening, and I wish you all further pleasure in the rest of this evening, and a long and profound relationship with Tel Aviv University. Bye-bye.
And now, for our final toast of the evening, a man who stands at the top of two industries, media and real estate. Please welcome the editor-in-chief of U.S. News and World Report, Mort Zuckerman.
Good evening. I come here tonight with the hat of a journalist, if I may. Journalism, as you probably know, is practiced by people who have no ideas and the ability to express them. And we are generally looking for, indeed desperate for, the right people to quote to give legitimacy to the ideas that we have that we would like to say we initiated but are shared by the great scholars in a particular field. So I can't tell you what a thrill it is for me to be with the three people whom I have quoted most often in my journalistic life of 27 years. Of course, Bernard Lewis, but also Henry Kissinger and Fouad Ajami, and they're all sitting at the same table. So I'm in a slight state of euphoria. And what I would like to do, if I may, is just quote, since I would never pretend to be able to express in writing or in speech anything close to the eloquence of Bernard Lewis. And I'm going to quote some of the things that I quoted from him, going back to 1993, for example, although it goes back earlier. On the grievances of the past in the Muslim world, the leading Islamic historian, Bernard Lewis, pointed out that the Muslim has suffered successive stages of defeat. First, his loss of domination of others, then the undermining of his authority in his own country through an invasion of foreign ideas, laws, and ways of life, sometimes even resulting in foreign rule. These changes would have been stressful enough if Muslim governments had been wise and just, but many were corrupt. Repression and poverty became the lot of their subjects. On top of all of this, the traditional Muslim has had to contend with the challenge to the mastery in his own home from the emancipation of women and a rebellion of children. For many, it has been too much. And then in 1998, he said, on America and its hostility to taking the lead in the war on terror, I'm quoting myself, you'll have to excuse me. Bernard Lewis, A History of Islam, pointed out the hatred springs not from this or that American policy in defense of Israel's right to exist, for instance, but rather as the inevitable consequence of America's leadership of the West. To the fanatics, Western ideas are seen as a threat to Muslim life, Muslim society, and even the Muslim family. And then in October of 2001, after 9/11 and Mayor Giuliani's moral clarity in the response to 9/11, Professor Bernard Lewis, the preeminent historian of Islam, gave us the right perspective on the deep nature of the psychological struggle in which we are now engaged. In his discussion of the historical humiliations of the Muslims, he wrote, "In the last 3 centuries, the West has dominated and enfeebled the Islamic world, which previously had thought of itself as more powerful and more advanced economically and intellectually. So the Muslim suffers," he said, "the undermining of his authority in his own country through the invasion of foreign ideas and laws, of ways of life, and finally the challenge to the mastery of his own home through emancipated women and rebellious children." And then in December of 2002, the Americans' response in the war against terror, Professor Bernard Lewis, the great authority on Islam, pointed out, the conclusion is that the terrorists drew from this that the United States had become frightened and incapable of responding, and the terrorist attacks of 9/11 was in part a result of this perception. In March of 2003, on War by New Rules, Bernard Lewis wrote, "The suicide bomber may well become a metaphor for those people as a symbol of hate and spite, rage and self-pity, and ruthless lack of concern for non-Muslims. We may not feel that we are at war with Islam, but the most radical elements in the Muslim world are convinced that they are at war with us." And later on that year, on Arafat's bloody work, yet November 1974 was the month in which he was invited to address the United Nations General Assembly, virtually unanimously. Asking Arafat to give up terrorism, explained Bernard Lewis, the Dean of Middle East Scholars, is like asking Tiger Woods to give up golf. Later on, in 2003, on the movement of Arabs out of Palestine in 1947, the eminent Arabist Bernard Lewis has written, "The great majority, like countless millions of refugees elsewhere, left their homes amid the confusion of and the panic of invasion and war, one more unhappy part of the vast movement of population which occurred in the aftermath of World War II." In 2009, in April 2009, a great Middle East authority, Professor Bernard Lewis, pointed out in Foreign Affairs how easily the West is misled. In contrast to reports in English, he wrote, the discourse in Arabic, in broadcasts, sermons, speeches, and school textbooks is far less conciliatory, portraying Israel as an illegitimate invader that must be destroyed. Israel cannot make peace with those whose first priority is to blow up Israeli women and children and who deny the nation's right to exist. As Bernard Lewis put it, there is no compromised position between existence and non-existence. And later on in that year, on President Obama's erosion of American support for Israel, Bernard Lewis, a noted historian in the Middle East, put it, "A nation can make few mistakes worse than this, to be harmless as an enemy and treacherous as a friend." In February of 2011, and after last year's political upheaval in Egypt, Bernard Lewis, the renowned historian of Islam, said, "Many of our so-called friends in the region are inefficient kleptocracies, but they're better than Islamic radicals." And in 2011, in March, after the Itamar massacre of a family of 5 in Israel last year, Professor Bernard Lewis, the great academic authority on Islam, has said that if the West knew what was being said in Arabic, people would be horrified. And again, after the revolutions in Egypt this past year, a Brotherhood victory is much in the cards as in any democratic election. Our outstanding expert on the Muslim world, Professor Bernard Lewis, pointed out that the religious parties have a network of communications through the preacher and the mosque which no other political party can hope to equal. Further, they use a language familiar to the people on the street in contrast to the language of Western democracy, which simply is not intelligible to the great masses. As many as 30 million are illiterate. To assume that a Western-style general election will be the solution is a dangerous fallacy. Is it any wonder, then, why those of us who try and write about the Middle East quote Bernard Lewis over and over and over again? For not only does he have greater insight than anybody else we know as a historian, but he speaks of it so eloquently that not only do we quote him, we aspire to be able to write and to speak like him. So he has been a great professor to all of us in the world of journalism who think about the possibility of what we might begin to understand about the Middle East. And that's understanding and that beginning, and indeed sometimes the conclusion of it, comes out of all the books he has written and all of what he has said. So I cannot tell you how honored I am to be a part of this evening, celebrating a man whom I have admired and quoted more often than anybody else. Congratulations to you, and thank you very much for including me.
Now, for a very special tribute, we're pleased to introduce a man who is proud to call himself a disciple of Bernard Lewis. Please welcome Professor Fouad Ajami.
Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. I don't know how I got this gig, but I'm going to enjoy it. So, as you know, this has been a somber day for our country. And we are reminded once again of the pathologies of that region. Ambassador Chris Stevens lost his life in Benghazi. He lost his life in the very same city he helped protect when Gaddafi had put the city of Benghazi on notice that he was coming to hunt down the people of Benghazi, house by house, street by street, alley by alley. So we know we really, in a way, always entangled in the pathologies of this region. And we know that that's why we have needed the great wisdom and the great insight of Bernard Lewis. Now, I want to say, I will begin, Gibbon always said about the personal pronoun, he said the personal pronoun is the most disgusting of pronoun. But I'm going to use the personal pronoun because I have some things to say about the way Bernard Lewis came into my life and into my scholarship and what his scholarship has meant to me. I'll never forget the arrival of Bernard Lewis in the New World. I think it's the best way to describe it in Lewis vocabulary. It was the fall of 1974 on the Princeton campus. He was then 58, a striking-looking man, elegant, speaking in full paragraphs, already a scholarly legend. The amazing thing about Bernard, and the amazing thing that I came to discover, and this is how actually I began to think of him, and I think it's apt, that in the colloquialism of the New World, Bernard was actually a cool guy. You know, I could have actually become more colloquial. I could have used a term that Frank Sinatra used to pay tribute to people by saying, he's a cool cat. Well, as you know, I don't think you can say the expression a cool cat about Bernard Lewis, but you can say he was a cool guy. Since Bernard Lewis has already told his life in his memoirs, I am free to say how Bernard Lewis arrived in Princeton. He came to Princeton with a lovely, engaging woman to whom he was not married. We all thought that was really quite exciting in the kind of staid atmosphere of Princeton. Well, I see that he's now with a lovely woman, Bunzi, to whom he's not married. So it appears that some things have not changed. My verbal range with the great man was quite limited at the time. I would run into Bernard Lewis and I would say, hello, Professor Lewis. Good morning, Professor Lewis. Good evening, Professor Lewis. He was then the exalted Dodge Professor of Middle Eastern Studies, and I occupied the lowly position of postdoc or something like lecturer, which, as you know, if you know the academic hierarchy, that really meant you could actually talk to the caterer when they bring food. So I think at some point, Professor Lewis grew tired of my deference. And he took me aside and he said, "You may call me Bernard." Well, the only thing I could say, again, I was still intimidated, was to say, "Okay, Professor Lewis." So you can call him Bernard. And by the way, he can tolerate Bernard, barely. But don't call him Bernie. That is completely out. Now, my lifelong devotion to this great man came when he finally asked me, he said, "Where are you from?" He asked me about my birthplace. So I told him I was Lebanese. I was born in Lebanon. He said, "I know. You're born in southern Lebanon." I said, "Yes, I was born in southern Lebanon." He said, "What's the name of your village?" So I had this village, Arnoun, which is a village without a paved road at the end of the world, a forsaken place. I told him I was from Arnoun, and he said, "You should come over. I will show you the land deeds of Arnoun." I came over and I saw the land deeds of Arnoun. So he gave me the history of that forsaken place, and I think that was the first gift. I think it was apt, it was fitting that Bernard Lewis came to America when he did, in the aftermath of the October War of 1973. I use the October War. I know most of you would use another name for it, but I prefer the October War. It's neutral. It's just simply the October War of 1973. America was acquiring new burdens in the region. We were becoming an imperial power in the Middle East. And how ironic and how fitting that the American statesman who was laying the foundations of this order in the region was none other than Henry Kissinger, who was then referred to as Kissinger of Arabia. I think one of the qualities, in addition to the fine, amazing mind and a feel for people, one of the things that qualified Secretary Kissinger, if you will, to become this great interpreter of the Middle East and this great interpreter of the Arabs is he was willing to kiss men and hold hands with them. And the late Golda Meir once asked Secretary Kissinger, said, "Do you kiss women, Henry?" Well, that was the introduction, if you will, to this new imperial order. Now, as we were acquiring this empire, as you might appreciate, we needed a philosopher, a guide, a storyteller, a wizard who would take us through the expanses and the alleyways of that civilization. And we found him in this man of wisdom, experience, and patriotism, a man unfooled and undeluded, a man who knew that the streets of the Middle East meander, that the streets of the Islamic world meander, that a street called Straight was as straight as a corkscrew, as straight as a corkscrew. These were the words of Mark Twain. I should say these are the words of Mark Twain, because as you know, plagiarism is rampant these days. And I think people should give credit when credit is due. So this was the beginning, if you will, of this imperial order, and this was the role of this great man who came to America in that time. "Come, sir, arise, away, I'll teach you differences." This is really a kind of wonderful passage from King Lear. This is the Earl of Kent speaking to Oswald. He says, "Arise, away, I'll teach you differences." And that is exactly what Bernard Lewis did in those eventful 38 years since his arrival in this country. He saw through fraudulent claims of Middle Eastern radicalism. He unmasked demagogues. And the wonder of it all, he was a historian, but he saw into the future. This was the genius of this man. In a secular world, allegedly so, in the 70s, at a time when religions were thought to be a thing of the past, he warned that political Islam was returning. In the 1990s, at the height of the illusion of globalization, if someone will give me $1 for every time I heard the rotten word, globalization, I'll really be able to retire. But this was that era of the 1990s, the era of globalization. He dismissed that fakery, and it was he and the late great scholar Samuel Huntington who warned of a clash of civilization that would replace the Cold War, The Davos men, remember them? You know, every time you run into someone, oh, I just came back from Davos. I say, what the hell? You know. I think I really actually, I don't mean to be so personal about this. I think I hold the record of how many times I was invited to Davos, and how many times I said yes, and how many times I canceled. I never went, but I always liked to say, I'll be coming. And then, of course, on the very same day I was supposed to go to Davos, I would stand on West End Avenue and see cabs go before me, and then return home and take a pass on the great wisdom of Davos. It was from Bernard Lewis and then also from Sam Huntington we learned the antidote to all that puffery in Davos. In 1998, long before Osama bin Laden became a household name. Now, I want to underline to you, just in case you missed the Democratic Party convention, Osama bin Laden is dead. You should know that. Just in case you didn't know that Osama bin Laden is dead. And I should say, though that's not relevant in this context, that General Motors is still alive. So I want to, so in a way, so again, in 1998, Professor Lewis found an obscure Arabic language daily published out of London. Now you'll ask, why are Arabic dailies published out of London? Because London is the only free Arab city. And that's it. So Bernard Lewis found in that obscure Arabic daily a fatwa by the same said Osama bin Laden, calling on Muslims to kill the Americans and their allies wherever and whenever they can be found and to plunder their possessions. Professor Lewis translated this fatwa, interpreted it for us, published it in Foreign Affairs under the title, a gripping title and a correct title, Licensed to Kill. On September 11, on a clear day like this one, 11 years ago yesterday, 19 young Arabs brought death and soot and ruin to our street. Those planes that flew into those buildings on that day awakened us from our slumber. And Bernard Lewis became a household name, from the archives to Meet the Press, and we were lucky to have that. Now, the remarkable thing about our honoree is the dignity with which he did his work, the dignity with which he did his work in a field which really lacks dignity and is completely full of controversies. Amid these controversies, when a new generation of radical scholars came up with the notion that somehow or another you have to belong to that region or give just unbounded fidelity, I think he was able to stand his ground against the disciples of the late Edward Said. And I think history will tell us who told the truth about that world, that Islamic world. So now you should know something about this great man, because you hear all these charges and counter-charges. Countless Arab and Muslim journalists, younger scholars, over the years sought my mediation to introduce them to our dear and revered teacher. And they all made the pilgrimage to Princeton to talk with him. They knew that he knew their world. And I want you to know there are colonies of Bernard Lewis devotees throughout the Arab and Islamic world. They're hidden, but they're there nevertheless. So I think you shouldn't somehow think that he dwells and he works alone. It's not simply true. Now, a parting thought, I'm the last speaker. The name of the singular historian and scholar will henceforth be associated with three lucky and great academic institutions. The first, SOAS, the School of Oriental and African Studies at the University of London, where he did most of his work. This is the early part of his career. The second great institution is Princeton, and the third is Tel Aviv University. This gift of a magnificent collection, this evening, is Bernard Lewis's dowry to the youngest of these brides to which he has been betrothed. Thank you very much.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Bernard Lewis.
Thank you. It would be a remarkable understatement to say that I am overwhelmed. But that's the best I can do. I am deeply grateful to those of you who have spoken and to those of you who have listened, more particularly to those of you who have listened. And I very much appreciate your presence here and all that you have done for me. I would like to read you an excerpt from my memoirs, Notes of a Century, which seemed to me to be appropriate to this occasion. I modified slightly to bring it up to date. I am 96 years old. On walks now, I must use a cane or a walker. I need hearing aids. I take naps. I eat less and weigh more. My short-term memory is not what it used to be. Muncie, the lady of my life, tells me that if I continue to degenerate, I will eventually become normal. I quote that as a witticism, but not with approval. Over the years, I must admit that I have deteriorated physically and even mentally, but not emotionally. I have lived a long life, and I have loved it for the most part. I have had an interesting and, on the whole, a rewarding career. I have written many books of varying quality, which were translated into almost 30 languages, which isn't too bad. I have explored all sorts of places and countries and been able to play more or less with quite a large number of languages. You know, with languages, it also works on the principle of buy one, get one free. My late wife was Danish. We used to go to Denmark every summer, I should say. And I learned Danish fairly well. And I found that if you learn Danish, you know Norwegian and you can manage Swedish. So does that count as one language or three? I don't know. As I said, I have explored many places and cultures and been able to play with many languages. Even there are many who dislike me, or who disagree with me, or with whom I have disagreed, are generally interesting and sometimes even stimulating. And I am grateful to them too. They're not as grateful as I am to my friends and admirers. I have a family and stalwart friends whom I cherish. There is a common Israeli phrase when offering birthday greetings to the elderly to say Ad 120 to 120. Sometimes nowadays they modify it by changing one consonant, one Hebrew consonant, and say Ad 120 to 100 like 20. which I think on the whole is a more attractive proposition. I'm approaching that rapidly. I have been in my long life and remain very fortunate. I am particularly fortunate in the way that you have honored and accepted me this evening. And for that, I am deeply grateful. Thank you, and thank you again.
Ladies and gentlemen, that concludes our program this evening. We invite you to join us for dessert in the garden foyer. Thank you for celebrating with us.